My father's will was clear. The land outside Willow Creek belonged to me, 57 acres of unspoiled earth that had been in our family for generations. He kept it untouched, partly for sentiment, partly because he believed in preserving what mattered. After he passed, I held on to that belief. I worked out of state, living modestly, never thinking that land would need guarding. It was mine. That was enough, until I returned and saw what had happened. Rows of houses stood where trees once whispered in the wind. Neatly paved streets, manicured lawns, plastic mailboxes. 98 identical homes stamped across my family's land like someone had wiped out my history and replaced it with suburbia. I didn't drive onto the property. I drove into a betrayal I couldn't yet explain. At the entrance stood a large wooden sign, Suncrest Meadows, a proud HOA community. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe I'd taken the wrong road. But the GPS matched. The land was mine. This was my place. And it had been built over without so much as a phone call. That I stormed into the nearest structure, a temporary office draped in banners advertising home tours and incentives. Inside sat a woman with bleached hair, pearls, and a pink blazer. Karen Wills. That's the name on her desk placard. She looked up with a customer service smile that faded quickly when I demanded to know what was going on. You must be confused, she said with a fake laugh. This land was purchased legally through county surplus. I told her she was mistaken. I never sold it. Never listed it. She raised her eyebrows and pulled a manila folder from a drawer like she had rehearsed this. We acquired it 2 years ago. County auction. Zoned and approved. You'll need to take it up with them. I walked out and made the call that same day. The county assessor's office told me something I couldn't believe. 3 years ago, after mail sent to my father's outdated P.O. box was returned undelivered, the land was flagged as unclaimed. After 2 years of silence, the county listed it as surplus and auctioned it off. One buyer. A company called Suncrest Holdings. Purchase price, $27,000. That land was worth millions. Suncrest Holdings had one registered executive, Karen Wills. That I asked for documentation. What I received looked legitimate on the surface, but something about the signature didn't sit right. The county insisted the process had been followed. Permits were filed. Zoning approved. Construction began. No red flags were raised. No one contacted me because no one thought I existed. That I hadn't missed property taxes. They had been prepaid by my father through a land trust. The trust dissolved when he passed, and my name was never updated in the county system. A clerical error, they said. A tragic oversight, but Karen had exploited that oversight perfectly. That I called my attorney. He called 3 more. The consensus was the same: this was fraud, plain and simple. But fighting it would be a marathon. Karen had money, connections, and momentum. 98 homes had already been sold. Dozens of families lived on my land. They had no idea they were trespassing. That I filed suit within the month. Property theft. Fraudulent acquisition. Forgery. But Karen struck back fast. Her legal team countersued, claiming I had abandoned the land, failed to maintain it, and allowed it to become a public safety hazard. She painted herself as a savior who cleaned up blight and created housing during a crisis. She wasn't just bold, she was strategic. She launched a PR campaign calling me a greedy outsider trying to destroy a community for profit. She went on local radio, crying about families at risk of losing their homes because of a stranger who ignored his land for decades. But I didn't retreat. That I flew back and forth for hearings. I paid expert surveyors. I subpoenaed the original permit records. Then, during discovery, we found it, an old zoning approval form with a signature that didn't match the county official's handwriting. My attorney flagged it for forensic analysis. It would take weeks for the report, but I knew what we'd find. Karen had forged her way into my legacy, and now, I was going to take everything back. The forensic report confirmed what I suspected. The signature on the zoning application wasn't just a mismatch, it was an outright forgery. The name used didn't belong to any current or former county employee. The ink age and pressure analysis showed it was done recently, long after the supposed approval date. That gave us what we needed to shift the case from a property dispute to criminal fraud that we filed an emergency motion to freeze further development and stop the HOA from selling more homes. Karen's lawyers responded with a flurry of technicalities, claiming statute of limitations, municipal error, and irreparable harm to homeowners. Their goal wasn't to prove innocence, it was to delay, confuse, and drain me financially. Karen had resources. Every hearing was another attempt to spin the narrative. She leaned on political allies, hinted at countersuits, and used HOA dues to fund her defense. She painted herself as a developer caught in a bureaucratic mistake, not a woman who stole land through falsified documents. Even when the court ordered a preliminary injunction, she filed an appeal the next day. Every delay bought her time, and she knew I was bleeding money, that I was living out of a camper behind a local mechanic's garage, having sold my house to fund legal fees. My bank account was shrinking fast, and Karen assumed I'd fold before the case reached trial. But every move she made only fueled me more. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about truth. She had built a lie on my foundation, and I was going to tear it down. That I started contacting former employees from her development company. One of them, a former assistant project manager, agreed to talk. He told us Karen rushed the early construction phase, cut corners, and even joked about how nobody would miss a dead man's forest. He didn't have hard evidence, but his testimony painted a picture of intent, arrogance, and exploitation. Then we tracked down a county clerk who had handled property documents during the time of the forged transfer. He testified under oath that he never processed the documents in question and would have flagged the signature if he had seen it. Combined with the forensic report, this made it impossible for Karen to argue ignorance. The court scheduled a full trial. Karen's demeanor shifted. The confidence began to crack. She didn't show up for depositions, sent proxies to hearings, and refused to settle. Meanwhile, her HOA started to fracture. Homeowners, initially supportive, began asking questions. Some had spent their life savings on homes built on disputed land. They had trusted her, and she betrayed them. That I held a town hall meeting at a rented community center. I explained the facts, showed the documents, and answered every question. I made one thing clear: I wasn't after them. I was after her. And I offered them a way forward. If I won the case, I'd give each homeowner two options: either buy the land under their home at fair market value or vacate within a grace period. No sudden evictions. No traps. Just honesty. That act turned the tide. The media coverage shifted. The story was no longer about a greedy landowner, it was about a man reclaiming what was stolen while offering dignity to those caught in the crossfire. Karen couldn't keep up. Her PR team stopped issuing statements. Her legal team's motions grew sloppier. Even her own board members began to resign. As the trial neared, the district attorney's office began investigating Karen for real estate fraud. Our evidence had triggered a broader inquiry, revealing this wasn't her first questionable deal. Another development 2 towns over had similar irregularities: shell companies, rushed permits, sudden land transfers. Her empire was cracking. The court ordered a temporary freeze on all Suncrest Holdings bank accounts. That cut her off. Without funds, her defense thinned. She tried offering a confidential settlement, $500,000 to walk away quietly. I didn't even respond. I wasn't in this for money. I was in it for justice. The trial date was locked in. I had witnesses, documentation, expert testimony, and public support. Karen had only a crumbling defense and a legacy of deception. Every home she built was now a monument to her greed, and I was ready to expose it all. The night before the trial, I stood at the edge of what was once my father's field. Nothing of the original land remained, only the memory of what it had been and the resolve of what it would become. I didn't know how the court would rule, but I knew one thing for certain: Karen had taken everything from me. Tomorrow, I'd start taking it back. The morning of the trial arrived, and as I walked into the courtroom, I felt a surge of energy unlike anything I had experienced before. This wasn't about money, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something that belonged to me, my family, and the generations that would follow. I wasn't walking into that courtroom as a victim. I was walking in as a man who had fought for truth and justice. Karen's defense team was ready, of course. They had the usual tactics: denial, misdirection, and claims that the land was acquired through legal means. But it wasn't about the argument anymore. It was about the facts. The forgery. The fraudulent land transfer. The lies she had built her empire on. The first day of the trial was filled with back-and-forth motions, objections, and the kind of legal jargon that could make anyone dizzy. But I didn't flinch. The forensic expert we'd brought in testified about the falsified signature, showing how it had been forged long after the supposed approval date. The county clerk's testimony about the absence of any valid processing from his office was even more damning. Karen's defense couldn't overcome this. The truth was clear, and it was relentless. Karen herself took the stand, and for the first time, she didn't seem as confident. She stammered when asked about the land transfer. Her carefully constructed lies unraveled quickly under cross-examination. The more she spoke, the more she exposed herself as someone willing to manipulate the system for her own gain. Her story about an innocent mistake fell apart. It was a calculated effort, and now everyone could see it, but even as Karen's defense crumbled, she tried to turn the tables. She argued that the homes built on the land had become someone else's dream, and that tearing them down would destroy families who had invested everything in their homes. It was a typical play: guilt and emotional manipulation. But it wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to be swayed by her attempt to turn this into a moral dilemma. This wasn't about destroying lives, this was about restoring the truth. The homeowners who had been swayed by her earlier lies began to speak out. One by one, they came forward to tell the court how they had been misled. They shared how Karen had presented herself as a savior, a developer who had saved them from a housing crisis. But they hadn't been saved, they'd been taken advantage of. And now, they were paying the price. There was a woman named Jessica, a single mother who had bought a home in Suncrest Meadows. She explained how she had been convinced to buy her house under the promise of a safe community. When she found out the land was stolen, she said, "It felt like my whole life was built on a lie." Jessica was one of the first to file a claim against Karen's company, and her testimony was powerful. It showed that Karen hadn't just stolen land, she had broken the trust of the people she claimed to help. The turning point came when the district attorney's office released a new set of documents. These were records from other developments Karen had been involved in, each one riddled with the same signs of fraudulent behavior. They revealed the scale of her operation. This wasn't just about one piece of land. Karen had been running a scheme that stretched across multiple counties, using forged signatures, illegal zoning requests, and shady transactions to build her empire. These new revelations opened the floodgates. Her entire network was exposed. Karen's lawyers tried to argue that she had been unaware of the fraudulent documents, but the evidence said otherwise. She was the architect of this entire operation. The court saw her for what she was, a calculated opportunist who had exploited the system to enrich herself at the expense of others. As the final day of the trial came, the judge made it clear that Karen's actions were no longer a simple dispute, they were criminal. The verdict wasn't just going to be about land restitution. It was going to be about holding her accountable for her actions, for the lives she had destroyed and the deceit she had spread across the county. When the judge issued the ruling, I could barely contain myself. The land was officially returned to me, and Karen's company was dissolved. But it didn't end there. The judge ordered restitution for the homeowners, fair market value for their homes, plus interest, and a fund for moving costs. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had been misled. Karen was arrested on charges of real estate fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. The district attorney's office had enough evidence to charge her with crimes spanning years. The homeowners she had wronged were given the opportunity to move forward, but Karen was left with nothing but the consequences of her own actions. That night, I sat at my desk, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders. It wasn't the financial restitution that mattered to me. It wasn't the land I had reclaimed. It was the truth that had finally been recognized. For months, Karen had spun her web of lies, and now, it had all come crashing down. That I had won, but more importantly, justice had prevailed. The land was mine again, and I had made sure it would never be used for exploitation again. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was someone who had fought back, and won. And that made all the difference. With the trial over and the verdict delivered, the fallout hit Suncrest Meadows like a tidal wave. Karen's arrest wasn't just a headline, it became a symbol of corporate greed brought to justice. Local news outlets dug into her history, exposing years of shady developments, backroom dealings, and suppressed whistleblowers. Suddenly, everyone wanted to distance themselves from her. Former associates, investors, even contractors came forward, eager to cut ties and save face. The county launched a full audit of all HOA-governed properties she had touched. Multiple properties were flagged for zoning violations, some of which were condemned entirely. Karen's name had once carried influence, but now it was synonymous with fraud. Her assets were frozen, her companies dissolved, and her legal team abandoned her once the final charges were filed. The image of her being led out of court in cuffs circulated everywhere. Justice had finally caught up with her. I met with a group of Suncrest homeowners again, this time under very different circumstances. Some had already decided to move, unwilling to stay in a community born from lies. Others chose to stay, opting to repurchase the land under new, transparent terms. I made good on my word, no one was forced out overnight. I gave them options, flexibility, and respect. It wasn't their fault they had been deceived, and I refused to punish them for it. With legal ownership restored, I walked the perimeter of my land for the first time in 2 years. The home still stood, but the silence was different now. There was no longer the tension of injustice. Instead, there was clarity. I wasn't standing on land stolen from me anymore. I was standing on ground reclaimed. That I took steps to convert part of the property into a conservation area, preserving what little was left of the original landscape. Where Karen saw dollar signs, I saw legacy. I worked with environmental consultants to restore native plant life, protect local wildlife habitats, and open access to students and researchers. This land had a story to tell, and I intended to let it speak for generations. Meanwhile, Karen's trial for criminal charges proceeded swiftly. With the mountain of evidence and public pressure, her plea deal came quickly. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she confessed to multiple counts of fraud and racketeering. She was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, along with full forfeiture of her remaining assets. The money was used to fund relocation support for affected homeowners and cleanup of her abandoned developments elsewhere. Her fall was absolute. The woman who once stood atop a fraudulent empire had become a cautionary tale. And I wasn't interested in gloating. I never needed her to suffer, I needed the truth to win. That was enough. News of the case sparked changes beyond our town. The state passed new legislation tightening oversight of HOAs, requiring independent audits and transparency in land acquisitions. They even named the act after our case, the Suncrest Reform Act. That ripple effect was proof that standing up, even when outnumbered and outspent, could create lasting change. Offers came in. Developers who wanted to buy back portions of the land for clean projects, journalists requesting exclusive interviews, even documentary crews asking to license the story. I turned down most of them. I wasn't interested in monetizing what had been a personal war. I wasn't here to sell a headline. I had fought for something sacred, and I intended to protect it. Instead, I worked with a local nonprofit to build a small community resource center on the edge of the land. It offered legal aid to homeowners caught in HOA disputes and provided education on land rights and property law. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else, and if it did, I wanted them to have the tools to fight back faster than I had to. Years passed. The trees began to regrow. The headlines faded. Karen's name disappeared from the public eye, buried under new scandals and forgotten by the short memory of media cycles. But for me, the silence was enough. It meant peace. It meant finality. That I kept one copy of the forged deed, framed in my study, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. A reminder that systems can be corrupted, people can be bought, and justice can be delayed, but not denied forever. That paper had once threatened to erase everything I had. Now it stood as proof of everything I reclaimed. This story wasn't about revenge, it was about resolution. About standing your ground when everything is taken from you. About knowing the difference between what's legally claimed and what's rightfully yours. Karen underestimated that. She thought I'd back down. She thought money and influence would bury the truth, but I didn't fight with rage. I fought with purpose. And in the end, I didn't just get my land back, I got something bigger. That I got my voice back. My peace. My name. And I made them pay for every inch they tried to steal.